USDM fanboys will argue until the big crunch returns the universe to a singularity about which of our great American liberators is superior. When Armageddon descends and transforms the world into a George Millerian dystopia, and the USDM boys' dream of being a Ron Swanson meets the Equalizer god of the Petrolands are dashed by the fact that they never actually learned anything about mechanics other than what makes more horsepower, they will huddle up in the prison cells of the local warlord, spitting and hissing at the JDM boys in the cells opposite, and comfort themselves with the only conversation they know of. Hey bro, Mustang or Challenger? Alright, that's enough self-relating for a little bit. The automotive landscape of America is very strange looking in. On one hand, it's a unique automotive ecosystem where phenomena not present anywhere else in the world thrive. On the other, it has, for at least the last 25 years, been supremely boring. While I am always a classic and vintage car enthusiast first, I can at least muster some interest in some cars that were in production after I was born. But as soon as that conversation shifts towards products from the shining beacon on the hill, my eyes glaze over like a thick velvety ganache. Yes, American manufacturers can pull the trump card of big V8 motor power burble loud noise, but it's a trick they've been pulling for 70 years. It's not exciting anymore. The fact that most of the cars produced in this period are about as inspiring as the Imagine Dragons song their adverts would later be soundtracked by certainly doesn't help. But I think the primary reason is that there just aren't any exciting narratives to weave around them. Sure, 2008 was a massive deal and brought two members of America's once monolithic Big Three crashing down to earth in a bitter sucker punch reality check. But call me biased, giant bloated corporation rotting from the inside out reaps the consequences of its own actions, except actually they didn't really because they got bailed out and nothing much changed, isn't a satisfying story. If they had died, it would be, in a perverse way, because at least then they could be mourned and their glory years idealized as the hauntological nostalgia begins to set in. Instead, we must simply stare on as one elevates corporate soullessness to a decrepit art form, another shambles on like the zombie who's convinced they aren't dead, and the third, in some depraved madness, attempts to combine both. All of this is to say that I fucking love American cars! Of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, hell, I'd even argue there was a resurgence in the 90s. The sheer excess of the great land yacht period is intoxicating, from its strangely elegant, chrome-laden retro-futurist jet-age beginnings to the unrivaled drunken sleaze with which it stubbornly discoed to an ugly, lonely end, like a Harry Dubois who won't wake up. There is simply nothing else quite like it. And for that, it is fascinating. But for those manufacturers who died before the malaise could set in, the independents, their image remains set in those early heydays. They did not get to travel that same journey, to celebrate their 50s success by partying into the 60s, continuing long after the party ended, bastardizing the American dream in a self-destructive binge into the 70s, before suffering ego death at the hands of the 80s import boom, and maybe even making a slight return to form in the 90s. What could have become of these characters in those times? What plans had they made to partake in it? How did they meet their end, and for the one who did struggle on, how did they deal with the decadence and depravity of the Big Three that threatened to snuff them out by simply taking up all the oxygen left in America's auto market? I didn't do a song this time. The Second World War marks a significant transitionary period for the American automobile landscape. In the early 30s, America was awash with automakers. Though the dominance of the Big Three was a clearly observable phenomenon, they were still fiercely competing for customers against a sea of independents like Franklin, Hotmobile, and REO, yeah, they used to make cars, to name but a few. The double whammy of the Great Depression and World War II, however, quickly made sure that many of these companies either bowed out of the automobile market or died stubbornly clinging to the masts of their sinking ships. The Big Three emerged as the clear victors of this Squid Gamian gauntlet, surviving through sheer economies of scale. It is hard to overstate just how enormous the Big Three were at this time. They weren't just the three biggest car manufacturers in the US, they made the world their battlefield. They made cars in Australia. Ford and GM also held stakes in the European market with entirely separate, dedicated model ranges. These foreign assets, along with their multiple brands and huge manufacturing capability to back them up, allowed them to competitively sell to any prospective car buyer. Quick side tangent, we in Europe are rightfully mocked for our DLs, GLXs, GSIs and SRIs so that we may discern your class merely from the letters on the back of your car. But in America, it was telegraphed to the whole world around you by the brand of the car itself. The textbook example is General Motors. The entry-level Chevrolet was for the blue-collar everyman, Pontiac was for people who didn't want a Chevrolet but couldn't actually afford a luxury car, and Oldsmobile showed that you were going places, that life was starting to pay you back a little bit. A Buick meant you were well off, and that the American dream was rewarding your patience with dividends. And at the top of it all, of course, was Cadillac. If you mention LaSalle, I'm exploding you with my mind. Chrysler mimicked this with its Plymouth Dodge DeSoto Chrysler and later Imperial brands, while the slightly more condensed Ford Mercury Lincoln hierarchy served the blue oval. By covering all bases within the automotive market, these Goliaths not only ensured they could sell to anyone, but also helped shield themselves from economic turns. In hard times, they could rely on their cheaper offerings to take up the slack and prop up the luxury ranges to keep them around until the downturn reversed and the extremely profitable Premier offerings start selling again. This was not true of the independents, smaller manufacturers who did not have the capital to operate this multi-pronged approach, and instead elected to occupy one or two segments only. This made them vulnerable, and after the Great Depression had made short work of most of them and the Big Three had fattened to a truly suffocating size from the biggest and juiciest war contracts, only the strongest had survived into the Cold War era. The year is 1954, a veritable tipping point in the US automotive industry. I don't have a source for that, it just feels like it to me, but I can show you why I feel like that. Here is North America. Chrysler, the smallest amongst the largest, looks like this. Ford looks like this, and GM looks like this. The year prior, Ford and GM entered a cutthroat price war that's seeing them take the Aramco approach to market dominance, produce 4 sexillion cars and dump them on the market at a price no one can compete with. They can even afford to lose money on certain models for a few years if it means squeezing out the competition. Additionally, Cadillac and Oldsmobile both came out with big, powerful overhead valve V8 engines in 1949, with the marketing craze around the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 being retrospectively credited with starting the love affair between the US car buying public and the V8. Developing such an engine is expensive, and many independents were caught with their trousers down by Caddy and Olds. What will become of the independents in this trying time?
Ladies and gentlemen, and themtlemen, welcome to the fight of the century! Tonight, you shall be witness to a scene of automotive carnage, the likes of which the world has never seen before and may never see again. Welcome to the War of American Independence! Choose your fighter! Studebaker, South Bend, Indiana.
The ever-venerable Studebaker was one of the oldest firms in American automotive history, having produced wheeled vehicles before the autocar had really caught on as a concept, and entered the fray with their first battery-electric vehicle in 1902. The company abandoned this surely dead-end technology and rapidly grew through the 20s, becoming the first American company to own their own proving ground in 1926. Things looked shaky in the wake of the Great Depression when company president Albert Russell Erskine threw around company finances so recklessly you'd think he was trying to deliberately bring the company down from the inside. New management had the firm back in profitability by the end of the year, and as part of their strategic reorganization, the firm withdrew from the upper ends of the market, downsizing its flagship Buick rivaling President model to Oldsmobile tier. World War II proved to be a fairly profitable conflict for Studebaker, building nearly 200,000 US-6 trucks, most of which were sent to do battle on the Eastern Front under the Lend-Lease program. Studebaker also made over 60,000 Wright Cyclone R1820 engines for the B-17 bomber, for which a second factory had been built in the southern outskirts of South Bend. Post-war, Studebaker downsized yet again. Though it was quick out of the gate to produce a modern overhead valve V8 as trends had begun to demand, it was positively diminutive, initially smaller than many straight sixes on the market, bringing Studebaker's model range to a mostly entry-level status along the lines of Chevrolet. In 1948, a new factory was opened in Hamilton, Ontario, bypassing Canada's strict import tariffs, and there was also a small facility in Vernon near LA which assembled kits shipped from the South Bend factory. Additionally, despite its age, the company was proving to be a forward thinker, making early moves in the proto-personal luxury segment with its Starlight and Starliner coupes.
Nash, Kenosha, Wisconsin!
In 1916, one Charles W. Nash, a higher-up at GM, was offered a truly monstrous salary to remain at the company after the bang-up job he'd done reshuffling the management and production structure. Nash, however, had been eyeing up the head honcho seat and declined the offer, instead opting to resign and purchase the Thomas B. Jeffrey Company. Founded 16 years prior, this firm produced popular vehicles under the Rambler name, and later Jeffrey in honor of the company's founder. Charles quickly put a stop to all of this paternal admiration and renamed the company Nash Motors in honor of himself. Under his stewardship, the company quickly grew in the 20s, absorbing the Mitchell and Lafayette companies, while its top-of-the-line Ambassador model became known as the Kenosha Cadillac. Nash cars were selling so well in the mid-20s that all the cars that could be produced were sold before they left the factory floor. Of course, the Great Depression rubbed its hands together and poof, Nash downsized its range in order to remain in the game, and towards the end of the 30s had similarly adopted an Oldsmobile-level market segment. The company was still doing very well though, enough that Charles had his company buy and merge with appliance manufacturer Kelvinator just because he wanted its CEO, George Mason, to be his successor once he retired. The new Nash Kelvinator Corporation leveraged its diversified expertise to great effect, introducing the world's first thermostatically controlled air conditioning in a car in 1939 and America's first mass production unibody in 1941. Nash produced all sorts for the war effort, from propellers and plane engines to binoculars, and continued to chug along post-war. Similarly to Studebaker, Nash established a foothold north of the border, buying a factory on Danforth Avenue in Toronto from Ford after war's end. Our starting year of 1954 is a strange time for Nash. On one hand, they have failed to develop a V8, still coasting on expanded versions of their straight six, and their styling, though executed with input from Pininfarina, had an odd all-fed-in approach. Intended to make the car look like it was floating, in actuality many likened it to a bathtub. Still, Nash pulled on its Kelvinator division that year to deliver its upgraded $345 all-weather Eye, an AC system that much more closely resembled modern car AC units, while most contemporaneous systems occupied most of the boot and cost the best part of $600. Together with their solid build quality, this cast Nash as a slightly more premium nameplate, and with a V8 to begin development later that year, they were still decidedly in the fight.
Hudson, Detroit, Michigan!
Founded in 1909, the Hudson Motor Car Company would quickly rise to popularity off the back of the inexpensive Hudson 20, though by the 1920s they had risen to a roughly Buick-level nameplate. The inevitable resultant downsizing from the Great Depression was somewhat mitigated through the expansion of its budget sub-brand Essex that had been introduced a decade prior. This allowed the company to sell well, considering the ramifications of Black Tuesday, while maintaining some of the prestigious aura that the name Hudson had begun to acquire. Into the 30s, Essex was replaced with Terraplane, which itself was dropped just before the war. Hudson, though an important contributor, did not manage to secure any singular large contract for the war effort, picking up bits and pieces here and there, with the largest being for the Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft cannon used chiefly by the Navy. This didn't stop Hudson from busting through the door in 1948 and introducing its step-down chassis, a primitive unibody that drastically lowered a Hudson's center of gravity compared to contemporaries, which in 1951 opened the door for Hudson to dominate NASCAR with its new flagship, the Hudson Hornet.
Life is a highway, I'm going to ride it all night long.
Yes, Hudson's existence in the current zeitgeist as being almost entirely the result of a 2006 animated family film about sentient vehicles, whose sequel brought up some seriously weird eugenicsy stuff, has somewhat poisoned the well of discussion about this otherwise storied mark. However, in regards to the Hornet story, the films tell a strangely accurate interpretation. From 1952 to 54, the low-slung Hornet dominated racing circuits, winning 66 out of the 108 NASCAR Grand National races held in that period. This was also thanks in part to Hudson's severe wear parts. Essentially an early version of the homologation special, these were racing spec parts available to order from factory through the regular customer catalogue, thereby clearing them for use in stock car racing. All the more impressive was that Hudson managed all of this on an archaic flathead straight six that, through the power of forged internals, twin carbs, and whole gas cam, enabled the 7X spec cars to not only outhandle the V8 competition from the likes of Oldsmobile, but also prove doggedly persistent on the straights. Combined with an unshakable, finely crafted build quality, Hudsons were considered a solidly premium nameplate in competition with Oldsmobile and Buick, with a select few valuing their excellent and comparatively communicative handling above the luxury-laden boatiness of a Cadillac.
Packard, Detroit, Michigan!
In the 1920s, ranked above Cadillac, above Lincoln, and before Walter P. Chrysler had any plans for the struggling Maxwell Company, there were the 3 Ps of American automotive luxury. They represented the utmost in craftsmanship and smoothness, rivaling even the European automobile ateliers of Rolls-Royce, Mercedes, and Isotta Fraschini. These makers were Peerless, Piersarrow, and Packard. So confident were Packard in the excellence of their product that for years their tagline had simply been, "Ask the man who owns one." The Packard story began in the dying days of the 19th century, when mechanical engineer James Ward Packard had saved up enough money to buy a new Winton, at the time considered to be one of the finest automobiles being made in the great United States. James, however, was not entirely impressed, and made his complaints known to Alexander Winton. Alex rebuffed these suggestions, and so James, along with brother William, pulled a slip-in Jimmy and recruited one of Winton's engineers to start their own company. Please. I can see him. With my waking eyes. No. No! No! Packard, unlike its prestigious peers, survived the Depression by introducing lower-priced models to keep shifting units while maintaining its premium aura, a truly noble achievement that kept the large company turning over until the war, when Packard made bank! Packard secured a license to produce Rolls-Royce Merlin engines from the Spitfire and began cranking them out faster than Mr. Beast acquires increasingly credible allegations. These engines were then shipped off to California and Texas to be put into North American P-51 Mustangs, of which more than 15,000 would eventually roll off production lines. Post-war, Packard would continue to build executive vehicles to exacting standards, although their immediate post-war styling proved to be contentious, with some referring to it as the pregnant elephant. Rap is just one of my fetishes, like an elephant that's pregnant. This design was modernized into the early 50s, along with Packard's venerable straight 8. Around this time, Packard, like Studebaker, began to experiment with the gestating personal luxury formula with the Caribbean convertible. Packard, among a certain audience, still commanded a great deal of respect in 1954, and with a modern V8 soon to reach production, what could bring them down?
Kaiser Jeep, Toledo, Ohio!
Kaiser Jeep formed from the merger of Kaiser Motors, a newcomer who had taken over the car manufacturing division of Graham Page post-war, and Willis Overland, a storied manufacturer who had at one point been second only to Ford in terms of total cars produced in the US. By the Second World War, though, those days had long since passed, and the tides had similarly turned for Graham Page. A disastrous joint venture with Hupmobile to revive the popular Cord 810 with their own respective engines resulted in Hupmobile's death and threatened to do the same for GP. Fortunately, World War II contracts began being dished out and GP secured a particularly lucrative deal to produce LVTs. Willis, meanwhile, joined forces with Ford and American Bantam to develop and produce the truck quarter-ton 4x4 Command Reconnaissance. The fucking Jeep. Willis would eventually produce over 360,000 Jeeps. Though the name seemingly came from the Ford GPW variant, Willis wasted no time taking full credit for both the vehicle and the name before the war had even ended. Post-war, Willis dropped its passenger car lineup entirely to double down on its Jeep range. Meanwhile, Graham Page ultimately sold its entire automotive division to Kaiser Frazer, a joint venture between Joseph W. Frazer, the then CEO of the car division, and industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser Frazer would be quick out of the gates with a modern post-war range, including some quirky innovations in the form of the split hatchback Vagabond. By the early 50s though, both Kaiser and Willis were struggling, and Kaiser especially saw the promise in the Jeep brand. The two merged in 1954 with hopes to expand into a fully fledged car maker. Willis had recently revived its passenger car range, Kaiser's range received a fresh and bold facelift that year, and a V8 was in the works to replace the tired old Continental-derived straight six that had been tuned and even supercharged in a desperate attempt to keep it relevant. The new company, though small, occupied a surprisingly broad range of the market.
So there we have our contenders! Place your bets now, because any one of these could make it to the big leagues. So stay tuned, and don't forget to see the big game! Alright, the camera's still rolling? Why the fuck are the cameras still rolling? Alright, get the shit out of here. Alright, get it out! Get it out!
What? What? Wait. Got me. Go on then. What's wrong? What's wrong? The game's rigged. They're all fucked. All of them. Studebaker, sure, their workforce is loyal, I guess, because they've got great pay, great benefits, and one of the best pensions in the industry. But their margins were razor thin because of it. Now the price war between Ford and GM's kicking off, they're losing money big time. Nash are probably the best off out the lot, but they're small and they know it. Long term, they know they need to merge for extra clout. Plus, they still haven't got a V8. Sure, they're making one. Ooh, great job, but that's a non-starter. They need one now. Speaking of Hudson, fucking Hudson. Alright, sure, they're dominating the track, but they haven't even started developing a V8. It doesn't matter their straight six is more powerful than most of the V8s out there. It's not a V8, and Americans want V8s. And plus, it's reached the limits of what it's capable of, so if they don't change things, they're not going to be winning races for very long. Oh, plus, they threw all the money they had left at developing the Jet, an economy car, fuel-sipping, small, compact economy car that can be optioned to be nearly as expensive as a Buick and doesn't have any of the elegant looks a Hudson should have. And just to top it all off, have you seen the economy lately? Have you seen how it's doing? Hello? The fuel's cheaper than cat piss at the moment. Everyone's rolling around in big Chevys and Oldsmobiles, for fuck's sake. I don't think I've ever seen you win that.
What do you mean you never seen me? I'm there all the time.
I don't think I've seen you win.
Are you recording?
What? No. What do you mean?
Packard, where did it go so wrong? I mean, yeah, they're getting a V8 to market next year. That's too late. They needed one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And they've lowered their prestige even more by entering even lower price brackets without adopting a separate brand name. And to top it all off, Briggs, the company that was making their bodies, yeah, the car bodies is like a pretty integral part of the car, right? Chrysler's just bought the Briggs factory and is charging Packard a fuck-off amount of dollars to lease it back to them. None of that's fucking anything compared to Kaiser Jeep, alright? Okay, Jeep name has potential. Money to be made. Not enough yet. Meanwhile, the Kaiser side is hemorrhaging money. That V8 they're developing, they don't even have the money to start making it, even if they get the damn thing finished. They tried to subcontract REO trucks to make it for them, and they're so short on cash they just sold themselves off to Bond Aluminium and Brass.
Meanwhile, Dave Potter, the guy who's designing the V8, just fucked off to develop Nash's V8. Fucking hopeless. So unless any of these guys start making some major fucking changes, the era of the independent US automaker is gonna be over pretty fucking soon. What the fuck are you still doing in my office? Get out! Get out! Jesus. Fuck!
There were two logical steps any of these companies could take. Merge to combine resources in an attempt to stave off the ever-encroaching threat of the Big Three, or trim their fat to specialize in an exclusive niche. Kaiser Jeep elected for the latter. 1955 would be the last year that a Kaiser or Willys passenger car would be offered to the US public, and from 56 onwards, Kaiser Jeep exclusively produced Jeeps. They chug along until the early 60s when they produced the popular Gladiator pickup and Wagoneer luxury SUV, arguably the world's first, at which point the Jeep brand became solidified and safe. The heritage of its other brands was sacrificed at the altar, but the company had managed to secure itself a seat at the table. For now. Meanwhile, Willys do Brasil would largely spin itself off from the company, selling most of its stock to Brazilian shareholders to gain some street cred, and would continue to build Willys passenger cars until the early 70s. Wow, okay. Meanwhile, tooling for the Kaiser cars would be shipped to Argentina, where a joint venture between the Argentine government and Kaiser would be founded, known as Industrias Kaiser Argentina. This company would also continue to develop and modify its own range of vehicles until the mid-70s. The remaining four, however, would not flee so easily. In 1954, Studebaker's balance sheet was negative, but they had no money to revitalize their model range. Studebaker was not Stupidbaker. They knew that keeping on alone, especially in the midst of the price war, was a non-starter. Packard, meanwhile, was beginning to struggle, suffering from the self-sabotage of their prestigious aura and the old man image it had begun to acquire. An anecdotal report tells of a man who bought a new Packard in the early 50s, and upon announcing this to his family was reprimanded by his grandmother. "Nobody drives Packards anymore!" Hoping to fix each other's issues, they came to an agreement, and Packard bought Studebaker to become the new Studebaker-Packard Corporation. In theory, the two companies complemented each other very well, with Studebaker occupying lower-end market segments while Packard took care of the luxury goods. However, to seal the deal and save themselves, Studebaker had neglected to tell Packard just how deep in the shit they were, which Packard quickly and rudely discovered. Packard had already developed their 55 and 56 model ranges, and considering the limited funds they were running with, they proved to be technological powerhouses. Torsion bar actuated self-leveling suspension and a 3-speed version of Packard's own automatic transmission, that essentially amounted to a lock-up torque converter with an overdrive bolted to the back, was available on all models. For 56, the transmission gained a push-button option, and Packard's V8 grew to an unparalleled size. Not only did its 6.1 litres of displacement show up the offerings of Cadillac, Lincoln, and Imperial, but in the Caribbean, where it was equipped with twin 4-barrel carbs, it output a claimed 310 horsepower, making it the world's most powerful production car. Side note, they really want you to know that this engine is free-flowing in this promo reel.
Free breathing.
Free breathing.
Free breathing. Free breathing. You're going to hear a lot about free breathing. Free breathing, free breathing, free breathing, free breathing, free breathing, free breathing.
That same year, the correct yet all too late decision was made to separate the entry-level Clipper model into a separate marque. 56 also saw the debut of the Predictor show car, which claimed to show the future direction of Packard's design.
See that? Looks cool, doesn't it? Looks nice. But what if I were to...
That being said, Packard's intention was to mimic the tall, prominent grills that had defined their 30s and 40s output, and they achieved the schnoz with a great deal more elegance than the infamous then-in-gestation Edsel. Not only was the Edsel's prominent proboscis predicted, but the acutely angled rear windscreen also accurately foreshadowed the 1957 model year Mercurys and Lincolns, which shouldn't come as a surprise as Ford hired many ex-Packard designers. Wait, why would they have? Though many of the Predictor's unique features wouldn't make it through to the prototypes for the 57 model year vehicles, including the incredible hidden headlights, Its sleek, simple yet carefully constructed lines meant it was still somewhat of a looker. Other prototypes for the 57 Clipper also show a much greater effort to distinguish it from the rest of the Packard range. As for what would power these new vehicles, oh baby! Clearly outdoing everyone in 56 hadn't been enough because Packard was preparing to take this arms race to Cuban Missile Crisis territory. Firstly, Packard's V8 would be expanded to a titanic 7.2 litres, utterly dwarfing the competition. As if that weren't enough, Packard were at least spitballing, bolting 4 extra cylinders on the end to make a V12. Very little information is known about this, except for the fact that it would have used a split-pin crank to allow for even firing. Personally, I think it's likely it would have been based on the smallest version of the engine, but this would have still furnished Packard's flagship with a 7.9-litre V12 at the very least. But none of it was to be. Packard's expensive model range just wasn't selling, and the corporation brought in aeroplane manufacturer Curtiss-Wright to restructure the company and bring finances out of the doom spiral. Packard's gorgeous Art Deco Detroit factory was immediately dedicated solely to Curtiss-Wright's military contracts, and the actual 1957 Packards ended up being fugly restyled Studebakers, produced alongside the rest of the Studebaker range in South Bend before the Packard name disappeared from catalogues entirely after 1958. An ignominious end for what was once the pinnacle of what the US auto industry had to offer. Studebaker itself marched on, gradually trimming its model range of dead weight until eventually it abandoned the midsize market altogether and focused on its new compact Lark model exclusively, with the Champ meekly challenging the truck market and the Hawk range taking on the likes of the Ford Thunderbird. Fortunately for Studebaker, the late 50s recession coincided perfectly with the Lark's launch, and the compact proved to be a good deal for a suddenly penny-pinching US populace. Studebaker sold Larks by the boatload and started making money again for the first time in years. Attempts were made to capitalize on this. Firstly, mimicking the Big Three, a foothold in Australia was established with a small facility in Tottenham, Melbourne, where complete knockdown kits from the Hamilton factory were assembled. Secondly, Studebaker's Italian importer, in an attempt to drum up some attention for the brand in Europe, had 2 Larks rebodied by Frewer, with the intent to sell 1,000 cars a year. And finally, the Corvette rivaling Avanti was introduced that, in supercharged form, briefly became the fastest US production car. But financial problems continued to dog the company. Lark sales began to fall off as Studebaker couldn't keep up with the annual program of facelifts set by the Big Three, and the revolutionary Avanti faced production problems due to its fiberglass body panels that resulted in thousands of delayed and cancelled orders. Studebaker needed the Avanti to save the company, but instead it proved to be a complete bomb. Banking the company's hopes on a low-volume sports car was a highly questionable move in the first place, and really goes to show just how desperate Studebaker were at that point. The suggestion of a flagship Avanti-based saloon never went beyond the prototype stage, and a similar fate befell the next-generation Lark and Hawk successor Scepter. The coupe was a gorgeous thing, sort of resembling a baby Buick Riviera, while the saloon was a little ungainly due to the Bauhausian attempt to reduce costs by making the front left door identical to the rear right door and vice versa. The Avanti disaster was the final straw for Studebaker, and in December of 1963, the long-standing South Bend plant ceased production. The Canadian factory continued for 2 more years, but at that point they were gnawing at bones. Negotiations were made with Nissan to sell their cars in the US as Studebakers, but Studebaker was Stupid Baker. They were also in talks with Toyota to do the exact same, and when Nissan found out, they promptly told them to fuck off, and Toyota declined to make an agreement not long after. With nothing left in the tank, Studebaker exited the automobile market and merged with Wagner Electric. From there, the remains of the once mighty Studebaker Packard Corporation were scattered to the winds, as the subsequent buyouts, mergers, and bankruptcies of the businesses that followed held no sanctity for the integrity of a company that, once upon a time, made some old cars. There was a secret side quest, though. Local Studebaker dealers banded together and bought the tooling for the Avanti, and continued to build Avantis on a very small scale, mostly with Chevrolet engines, in South Bend until 1987. The company changed hands and moved to Youngstown, Ohio before finally ceasing production in 1991. meaning the Avanti had been intermittently in production for 29 years. But what of Nash and Hudson, I hear you cry? Well, as previously stated, Hudson was well and truly fucked. The all-too-conventional and conservative, yet somehow still overpriced jet had proven a sales catastrophe. Some have retrospectively laid the blame at the feet of longtime company head Abraham E. Barrett and Jim Moran, an influential Hudson dealer, who both favored the contemporary and relatively restrained design language employed by Ford for the new car over Hudson's own styling director Frank Spring. Spring was by all accounts a very eccentric man. From the descriptions I've read, I imagine he found himself in mid-century America after accidentally stumbling out of a Wes Anderson film. It was under his tenure that the timelessly gorgeous 51 through 53 Hudsons were penned, but when the brief for the jet came in, at the time named the Bee in keeping with Hudson's naming conventions of stinger-equipped insects, Spring steered in a radical Italo-futurist direction. Spring was of course overruled by Barrett, and hoped when Barrett saw the frumpy, slab-sided version of the jet he had commanded, he would be swayed back to Spring's original vision. Barrett, of course, loved the new jet, and ordered it to production immediately. Spring's original concept was modified into a lower-set two-door sports car and dubbed the Italia, production of which was subcontracted to Touring Superleggera as a low-volume Halo model. Its obscene price due to its nightmarish production process combined with lackluster performance owing to the decision to base it on the jet rather than the Hornet meant Hudson couldn't even sell the 25 it had planned, with just 19 orders being fulfilled. All of this tanked Hudson's finances, and so an agreement was reached with Nash in 1954 to combine the two companies into one. What was publicly branded as a merger of equals was in reality a case of Nash buying out Hudson, but to promote the company's new image, a new name and logo for the corporation behind the two names was created. A name you probably have heard of. The American Motors Corporation, AMC. The new company promptly killed off most of the Hudson division, briefly converting the Detroit factory to military production before selling it off to Cadillac in 1956, and cobbled together a range of 1955 model year Hudsons by restyling Nash's. Production was moved to the Kenosha factory, and the era of true Hudson cars was dead in the water. Spring had taken advantage of Touring's contract with Hudson to develop a prototype known as the X161, a full-sized Hornet-based car that incorporated the design language of the Italia. Many theorized since that this was his vision for a 55-56 model year Hornet, but with Nash's decision to neuter Hudson, this never came to be. A similarly Italian-flavored full-size was created in 1955 for Nash by frequent collaborator Pininfarina. Their proposal was lower, leaner, and cleaner than Nash's existing range, and holds up to this day as a veritable hidden gem of car design. Naturally, Nash merely incorporated some elements of this prototype into its existing flying bathtub aesthetic. For 1958, AMC, under the leadership of George Romney, yes, that Romney, dropped the Nash and Hudson marks entirely, opting to rebrand to Rambler, invoking not only Nash's origins, but also the increasingly popular Nash Rambler economy car. Like Studebaker, AMC largely pivoted towards the economy segment. Though AMC maintained a presence in the midsize market, compact cars remained AMC's bread and butter. By excelling in segments the big three largely gave an afterthought to, AMC kept on keeping on. In 1960, a deal was struck with Australian Motor Industries of Melbourne to assemble complete knockdown kits down under, and in 1970 they bought Kaiser Jeep, granting access to their dedicated market. With vehicles like the Rambler American, AMC Hornet, and later the Gremlin, AMC's talent for producing frugal economy cars acceptable to American tastes cannot be discounted. This, of course, won them a lot of acclaim in the 1970s, when the oil crisis suddenly meant that AMC were teed up perfectly for a near decade of sustained success. AMC leaned into this, subtly exploiting their underdog status to lightly poke fun at themselves with moderately self-aware marketing, winning the hearts of many customers in the process. After years of this show, though, one gets the sense that the public had grown tired of AMC's one-note set, and when the Pacer was unveiled as the world's first wide small car in 1975, achieving weirdness orders of magnitude greater than the Gremlin, it proved a step too far, like when a self-deprecating bit stops being funny and just becomes a bit pathetic and awkward. AMC would attempt to live on with the Spirit, Concorde, and scarily predictive proto-crossover Eagle, but apart from the latter's moderate success, AMC's finances remained stubbornly red. The company had scarce few options left, and so in the late 70s, it ended its status as a truly American independent and sold itself off to Renault. How this would have panned out, we'll never know. Renault itself became worryingly short on coin in the late 80s, and was under pressure to sell off its American assets, when new chairman George Bess announced his continued dedication to maintain Renault's presence on the continent. However, as part of his restructuring efforts, workers in France were laid off, and as such, he was rightfully fucking assassinated by Action Direct, a communist paramilitary group, for being an enemy of the working class. His replacement, Raymond Levy, immediately set about selling the remains of AMC to Chrysler. Didn't stop Chrysler from continuing to use AMC straight six in Jeeps deep into the 2000s, though. With that, the era of the independent US automaker was decidedly and truly over. Both because any last trace of AMC had been wiped from the earth, but also because that concept itself didn't really mean anything anymore. From the 80s onwards, the import boom snowballed, and US roads became home to more cars made abroad than ever before. Additionally, many Japanese manufacturers started making their cars in the US itself to avoid import taxes. The relevance of the Big Three as a concept was waning, and has continued to wane ever since, as in comparison to the rest of the industry, they simply aren't the titanic juggernauts they once were. They stagnated, and the rest of the industry caught up. But things could have gone oh so very differently, because it is all too plausible that in the mid-50s, the Big Three could have become the Big Four. Yes, Studebaker and Packard merged, as did Nash and Hudson, but both parties knew they still couldn't challenge the GM Ford Chrysler trifecta alone. No one was more aware of this than Nash/AMC CEO George W. Mason. Remember that guy? He got in touch with James J. Nance, the man who had masterminded Packard's acquisition of Studebaker, and the president of the new Studebaker Packard. Nance and Mason were well aware of each other, having formerly been rival CEOs when Mason ran Kelvinator and Nance chiefed Hotpoint. This didn't mean, however, that they couldn't share a good chat. Mason had a dastardly idea. In informal conversations, he pointed out to Nance that the two companies could serve each other's interests. AMC were developing a V8 but had yet to get it to market, and similarly did not have their own automatic transmission. AMC could buy Packard's V8 and transmission and fit them in Nash's and Hudson's for the 1955 model year. Nance agreed to this proposal, and it would go on to make it to the road. Mason also proposed something a little more radical: his broader strategic aims for surviving against the Big Three. I imagine he must have posited that AMC and Studebaker Packard were awfully good fits for each other. Studebaker makes blue-collar cars and trucks with sports cars on the side, all much in line with Chevrolet. Nash maintains a bit more of a premium aura, and Hudson a step above that. And if Clipper were to be separated from Packard, as it was later on, to sit as a slightly more attainable companion brand, together the two companies would have a 5-mark range between them, each occupying a similar market segment to their equivalents at GM and Chrysler. There was little long-term hope for these companies staking their individual claims in the market uncontested indefinitely, so what if they were to combine their efforts? What if Studebaker Packard were accepted as new states in the Union of AMC? This idea wasn't out of the question. Both companies had recently merged, why not merge again? There was much to gain too. The resultant corporation would have overtaken Chrysler to become the third largest automaker in the United States. In our own timeline, these talks were never more than informal talks between two American capitalists. Nance was entertained by Mason's idea, but fired back that he wasn't interested unless he would become leader of the expanded AMC. Any chance for his mind to be swayed would be dashed soon after when Mason came down with acute pancreatitis and pneumonia, leading to his death at the age of 63. Causes of this are officially unknown, but given he was over 300 pounds, described as gregarious, and accepted wisdom at the time dictated the best cure for basically any form of bodily pain was a self-prescription of a bottle of bourbon lunch and 500 cigarette dinner, I'm surprised he made it to his 6th decade at all. George Romney succeeded Mason and announced within a week of his death that There are no mergers underway either directly or indirectly. And that was that. But if you would for a moment allow me to take your hand and venture with me into the world of alternate history. No, not that one! There's only a few things that have to go differently here for the fourth American auto giant to form. Mason and Nance start talking a little earlier. Nance's ego and self-interest are tamed more easily, or Mason offers a co-chair arrangement. And finally, Mason lays off the booze and doesn't kick the bucket at least quite so early. With the combined diversified operations of the Kelvinator side of Nash and Studebaker's many subsidiaries, the new company would have had a solid, profitable base to rely upon. Studebaker's Chippewa Avenue facility to the south of South Bend was nearly exclusively used for defense contracts, meaning that combined with Packard's additional defense contract capability, Hudson's factory could be kept operational, itself vastly increasing the likelihood of Hudson remaining independent of the Nash model lineup, potentially resulting in the X161 seeing the light of day. Who knows, with the increasingly Italian flavour of this Super AMC, as Packard had also previously collaborated with Pininfarina to deliver some concept cars, maybe the Nash Pininfarina Ambassador finds its way to showrooms as the flagship Nash. Packard's 55-56 model range would largely be implemented without much change, following into the clean lines and Goliath engines of the proposed 1957 line. That year would also see the much lighter AMC V8 replace Packards on the Nash and Hudson lines, as it did in our timeline. It's nearly impossible to predict what the cars would have looked like beyond this, although I'd like to think the Studebaker Avanti and Scepter make it to the roads. Brooks Stevens, who penned the 62 facelift for the Gran Turismo Hawk and all versions of the Scepter and New Lark, also envisioned what looks like an extremely early MPV. Maybe this Super AMC invents the minivan a decade ahead of time. Stevens also offered his 2 cents on what a late 60s Packard could have looked like, Harp grille still very much intact. This of course is all conjecture. What we can more confidently posit is where the company may have gone from there. It's highly likely this Super AMC purchases Kaiser Jeep as in reality, and begins expanding into Australia. This larger company would want to establish a more substantial operation than a mere warehouse to assemble CKD kits though, and perhaps they buy Australian motor industries outright in a bid to achieve this. At some point they would have wanted to expand into Europe also. The 1961 bankruptcy of the Borgward Group in Germany would provide ample opportunity to do just that, as surprisingly few manufacturers showed much committed interest in buying the company. Although by 61, finances may not have fully stabilized at Super AMC, so it could have been a very risky move. Perhaps it attempts to outbid Chrysler for the Roots Group or Simca a few years later, or buy Glaz before BMW can assimilate them, maybe even intervene in DAF's decline before Volvo can sink their teeth in. How would it have approached the Malaise era? Would it have maintained its knack for economical compact cars that kept AMC alive through that period in our timeline? Or by expanding to meet the big three head-on, would it have adopted the same market approach that led to neglect of that segment? Ultimately, what would become of the company? The cutthroat nature of capitalism dictates that eventually many companies are whittled down to few, and from there the few are often whittled down further. Does it fall on hard times and find yet another partner? Does it miraculously succeed and force Chrysler down a yet darker path? All of these questions would essentially need a work of fiction to answer. Though I'm sure an interesting story could be told, I am not yet the person to write it. I occasionally browse r/imaginary maps, but if you ever catch me posting there, just vaporize me on the spot. It'd do us both a service. Oh, you've met before? Seeing as it's now taken up a decent chunk of this video and more than a few of my videos previously, I feel like I need to address why I seem to be so enamored with what could have been. I think maybe it's because when we look back in history, it's far easier to point at and make examples of things we think went wrong rather than things we think went right. It's easy to see history as a series of branching paths of missed opportunities. Like the long, slow death of Rover compared to the innovative products it was developing, Mazda's failure to get Amati to the market and become the fourth member of Japan's Big Three, the loss of Facel Vega and how unique it was. I often find myself thinking that the world of cars wouldn't just be more interesting, it wouldn't just be more diverse, it would be better if these diversions hadn't been taken. There's something distinctly hauntological about that, the idea that something more interesting, more unique, better existed in the past, yet continues to persist in a sort of broader subconscious, either through direct or inherited memory. Consequently, there's a feeling of being robbed, like a better history and a better present has been stolen. Of course, that all applies to a lot more than just the car industry. I mean, ironically, it's the loss of that kind of intensive manufacturing industry in the West that's contributed to a certain sense of lost greatness that has been encouraged to foully ferment by the modern fascist movement. But I know, logically, that every opportunity is missed thing I said earlier is plainly incorrect. I mean, even within the car industry. Yeah, sure, Saab's no longer with us, but they pioneered the use of turbos, and where would we be without that? Audi could have decided that they didn't need to pursue a campaign in rallying, and we wouldn't have the Quattro. VW management could have just been a little bit more apprehensive, and we wouldn't have the Golf GTI. Maybe it's true that the world would have been better with a Packard Clipper Hudson Nash Studebaker Jeep AMC in it. You know, at the very least, maybe things would have been more interesting. Maybe it's true the world would be better if that battle or that war or that election had gone differently. But to state the obvious, the past has happened. We can't control it now, and we should never wallow in it. If anything, the fact that a better world could have existed could and should inspire us to manifest that better world now. Talk to your friends, organise something, make an effort to do something good. In a world where nothing ever happens, make something happen. In the modern world where everything seems fucked and everybody appears to suck, it's hard to care. I find it hard sometimes, and especially with all the algorithms and AI that increasingly control what's put in front of our eyes, it seems easier and easier not to care, which is terrifying. But if you can find a community or group of people who seem to give a shit, it's a much more liberating feeling than giving in to the doomerist slop.